group of farmers walked away from an island covered in thousands of sheep, convinced nothing there could survive. The storms were brutal, the land was stripped bare. These animals weren't built to live without people. But decades later, when a new team stepped off a helicopter, they froze at what they saw. The flock hadn't died out, it had become something else entirely. The sheep boom that ended in disaster. Campbell Island lies about 410 miles south of New Zealand's South Island, out past the main shipping lanes, in water that sends storm after storm across its hills. The island is not huge, only a few dozen square miles of land shaped by an old volcano and carved by a long, narrow inlet called Perseverance Harbor. Most of the ground is wet peat and tussock grass. Trees are almost completely missing. Instead, you get waist-high and chest-high plants with big leaves and thick stems, known as megaherbs. They soak up what little sun they can and shrug off cold wind and salt spray. From a ship's deck, the place looks empty and harsh, more like the edge of Antarctica than a normal farm. The first recorded European to see this island was an Australian sealing captain named Frederick Hasselborough in the early 1800s. He was sailing a small ship called the Perseverance, hunting fur seals for skins that would be sold in distant markets. He named the island after his Sydney employer, a merchant named Campbell, and word spread that this was another rich sealing ground. Within a few short years, sealing ships were dropping hunting gangs on shore, clubbing and skinning thousands of animals, and loading the hides into their holds. By the middle of that century, seal numbers around Campbell Island and other sub-Antarctic islands had crashed. The quick money was gone, but the island stayed on the charts as a lonely, rough piece of New Zealand territory. Once the seal boom faded, whalers also used Campbell Island as a base and shelter when they were chasing whales through the Southern Ocean. They were never there to settle. They came, took what they could, and left when the season ended. The island picked up a reputation among sailors as a miserable place to camp. The wind never really stopped. The ground was boggy. Fog could roll in and stay for days. But to people in New Zealand's growing farm world, that wet grass and open ground looked like something else. Unused grazing land. If you were used to pushing sheep into every valley you could reach, Campbell Island started to look less like a rock and more like an opportunity. In the 1890s, New Zealand's government added Campbell Island to a program that let private farmers rent remote crown land for grazing. Anyone with enough money and the right contacts could take on the island as if it were just another high country station. The first person to do that was James Gordon, a farmer based near Gisborne. He arranged for a ship to carry about 400 sheep, along with timber and supplies, across those southern waters. The sheep were turned loose on the hills, and small buildings went up near Perseverance Harbor so men could live there, shear the flock, and store wool until the next boat arrived. The animals that Gordon and the men after him chose were mostly merino or merino cross sheep. These are fine wool sheep that can produce very soft, valuable fleece, but they are not built as wild mountain survivors. Their wool keeps growing all their lives. On a normal farm, humans step in every year with shears, medicine, and fences. Without that help, the fleece turns from a clean coat into a heavy, dirty blanket. In 2021, a feral merino in Australia, nicknamed Barak, was found with a fleece that weighed around 78 pounds. He could barely walk, and he could hardly see. That is the sort of animal these farmers were putting on a cold island, and then leaving for long stretches of time. Not long after Gordon started, money troubles hit. Around the start of the 1900s, a new man took over the lease, Captain Tucker from the local militia. Tucker did not scale back. He sent at least 3 more shiploads of about 1,000 sheep each to Campbell Island, again using mainly merino-type animals. The idea was simple. More sheep meant more wool, and more wool should mean more income. For a while, it looked like that logic was holding. The animals spread out over the ridges and valleys, nibbling their way through tussock and megaherbs, and lambs kept coming each year. By 1916, 2 businessmen from Otago, J. Mathewson and D. Murray, had taken over. They set up a company called the Campbell Island Company to run the place. Shepherds and shearers agreed to 1-year stays. A ship took them down, put them ashore in this wet, isolated place, and they were told to make the farm pay. Diaries from men like Alfred Austin show how hard that was. They wrote about days when the wind tore at their clothes, when rain came sideways, and when fog swallowed the hills completely. But as the years passed, the flock kept growing, with no wild dogs, no wolves, and no coyotes. The main limit was simply how much grass and herb growth the land could produce. For a time, the flock had more than enough to eat, and by around 1913, numbers reached somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 sheep. From a distance, whole hillsides looked pale where hooves and teeth had already worked the green cover down. The weather never stopped doing its part. Strong westerly winds can hit well over 60 miles an hour, and gales sweep across the island many days each year. For people, that meant cold hands, damp clothes, and cabins that needed constant repair. For sheep, it meant something else. The wind and cool air kept insect numbers down, especially the blowflies that caused deadly fly strike in warmer parts of New Zealand. With no big land predators and fewer flies than back on the mainland, you could almost believe this harsh place might be safe for them. But plants do not regrow fast when the soil is thin and the growing season is short. As the decades went by, the most tasty grasses and herbs on the easiest ground were eaten down to the roots. Hooves cut deep tracks into the peat. On some ridges, the soil started to slump away, leaving raw scars where wind and rain clawed at what used to be pasture. At the same time, the outside world was changing. Wool and meat prices slid in the years leading into the Great Depression. Running sheep on a remote island went from a risky but possible business to a losing one. In 1927, a farmer from Waitati named John Warren took a gamble and bought the lease at auction. He shipped in about 5,000 more sheep, trying to turn a struggling operation into a profitable one. Within a year, he was already asking the government for the right to hunt seals as well, saying that he was making a loss on farming alone and needed another way to bring in money. Then the global crash hit. Wool and meat prices slumped even further in 1929. 2 years later, a broke Warren and his workers finally left the island. When a ship finally picked them up in 1931, the men had not eaten bread or fresh vegetables for about 8 months. They brought back bales of wool and some seal skins, but the price of that wool barely covered the cost of hiring the ship that came to pick them up. They also did not take most of the sheep. When Warren and his crew sailed away, they left behind a flock that still numbered in the low thousands. On paper, that might not sound like a disaster. After all, sheep graze hillsides all over the world, but these were domestic wool sheep that had been pampered for generations. Without people, their fleece does not stop growing. Heavy wool makes them slow, traps mud and moisture against their skin, and can hide wounds and infections. Their hooves can rot in wet ground if no one trims them. Many ewes struggle to give birth without help. These animals are easily spooked and can literally die from stress after a bad fright or an untreated injury. Barrock's fate is what many people would expect for thousands of wool sheep left on a cold island with no shearers, no medicine, and no one to pull them out of bogs or turn them upright when they toppled. Yet that is not what happened on Campbell Island. The first years after abandonment were almost certainly brutal. No one was counting then, but it is easy to see which animals would have failed first. Any sheep that could not move well under a heavy fleece, that had weak feet, or that needed help at lambing time would have died and left no lambs behind. The survivors would have been the ones with slightly hardier bodies, stronger legs, better hooves, and perhaps coats that did not mat quite as badly. As seasons passed, those survivors bred more like themselves, and the flock slowly turned into something tougher than the original farm stock. When scientists finally did a count in 1958, they found that sheep numbers had dropped from about 4,000 in the early 1930s down to roughly 1,000 animals. That fall in numbers gave the island's plants a chance to catch their breath. In places where the flock had once been dense, tussock and megaherbs started to creep back. At the same time, the sheep that were still alive were no longer farm animals in the normal sense. They were a feral flock that had survived almost 3 decades without any human care at all, shaped by cold wind and wet ground. While all of this was happening on the hills, the way the government saw Campbell Island was also changing. After Warren left, the lease was allowed to lapse. In the 1930s, officials began to talk about the island more as a place that needed protection than as a farm. In 1937, it was formally set aside for the preservation of its plants and animals, and in the 1950s, it was officially declared a nature reserve. The wild flock, the damage, and the fight to restore the island. When people finally came back to Campbell Island in the 1970s, they expected to find half-dead farm animals hanging on by luck. Instead, when the helicopter doors opened and the first teams walked out into the wind, they realized the flock they had left behind was not the same flock standing in front of them now. These were still white sheep, but they moved, looked, and behaved like something that had been rebuilt by the island itself. Up close, the first thing that hit the visitors was the fleece. One wool expert later wrote that his first impression was of miserable, bedraggled animals with peat-stained coats hanging off them in strips. Yet when he pushed through the mud and really looked, he saw strong lambs standing beside ewes that looked, at first glance, too fragile to even stay on their feet. Compared with the neat, tightly clipped flocks on mainland farms, These island sheep stood taller and carried their heads higher. Their bodies were a little longer and leaner, with the kind of build that helps an animal climb wet slopes and jump over boggy hollows. Years of biting at tough plants had worn some teeth down and twisted a few jaws, a clear sign that these animals had been living on hard stems and fibrous leaves, not on soft grass. Their fleeces were thinner and more open than fine wool merinos. After decades with no blade or hand on them, many of the island sheep had begun to shed at least some of their wool by themselves. In addition, they had evolved resistance to foot rot. Foot rot is a painful disease that eats away at the skin between a sheep's hooves, especially in wet places. On mainland farms, it can spread fast unless people step in with trimming and treatments. Campbell Island is cold, soaked, and full of boggy ground, so you would expect foot problems to be everywhere. Instead, by the 1970s, the wild flock showed clear resistance. The animals that could not keep their feet sound had died out. The ones left were the survivors, carrying tougher feet and tougher skin, and passing those traits on to their lambs. Their behavior had changed just as much as their bodies. Farm sheep are usually easy to gather and move. Many will stand and stare until dogs and people almost walk into them. The Campbell Island flock did the opposite. As soon as people came into view, the sheep gathered on their own and flowed away over the hummocks, picking lines through deep peat and rock as if they had spent their whole lives reading that ground. Musterers who were used to mainland stations found themselves left behind by animals that could climb faster and choose surer footing than they could. The ewes were fierce mothers. Lambs were on their feet and following within minutes, not lying helpless on the ground for a long time like many farm lambs do. Farmers and reporters later noted another strange habit. Many of these ewes gave birth while standing up. Instead of dropping to the ground during labor, they stayed on their feet, pushed out the lamb, and then stepped only a short distance away. That habit kept both ewe and lamb out of the cold hollows that fill with water and helped them avoid getting stuck in soft peat. And because the lambs landed on open ground with no dry bed under them, they were already trying to stand in their first moments of life. As noted earlier, by the middle of the 20th century, the island had been set aside as a reserve for native plants and animals, and later it became part of a wider World Heritage Area. That meant the same government that once leased the island for farming now had a different job: protect the subantarctic ecosystem that was left. Scientists and conservation staff could see that the wild flock was still stripping covers that seabirds and other wildlife needed. Thick Dracophyllum scrub, which is a tough shrub layer like a low, tangled forest, could not spread the way it should because sheep kept eating new shoots. Bare peat was washing away on steep faces. Royal albatross, rare ducks, and penguins all depended on a healthy mix of tussock and megaherbs, and that mix was under constant pressure from the flock. So a hard choice was made. In about 1970, crews put a fence right across the island. On the northern side of that line, every sheep they could find, about 1,300 animals, was shot. On the southern side, a similar number was left alive. The idea was to give one part of the island a full break from grazing so plants could recover, while keeping a live group of sheep at the other end for study and for a possible breeding rescue later on. Soon, the contrast was already clear. On the side without sheep, megaherbs and tussock grasses started to thicken. Young Dracophyllum bushes pushed up through the peat and spread along the slopes. On the side with sheep, many of those same plants stayed cropped short or were missing altogether. Over the next few seasons, botanists began to record just how fast the plant life bounced back when mouths were taken away. That evidence would later become one of the strongest arguments for taking the flock off the island entirely. The sheep were removed in three main waves between about 1970 and the early 1990s. First came the fence and the clean-out of the northern group. Then, through the mid-1970s and into the early 1980s, small teams of skilled hunters worked through the southern end on foot, shooting groups of sheep and then returning in later seasons to deal with survivors. Finally, in the late 1980s and around 1991, ground teams and helicopter crews carried out intensive searches until they were confident that no animals remained. In total, roughly 7,000 sheep were shot over those years. While all this was going on, other introduced stocks were also taken off the island. A small herd of feral cattle, left from earlier farming days, was removed by about the mid-1980s. Brown rats, which had come ashore long before with ships, were finally wiped out in a separate project in the early 2000s. When the last sheep and other grazing animals were gone, the change in the ground cover became even more obvious. Big herb plants spread back across slopes that had been almost bare, and tussock grasses grew taller and thicker. But the story of the sheep themselves did not stop there. Far to the north, in a quiet paddock in New Zealand, a handful of survivors from that wild flock were beginning a very different chapter. The last survivors. While most of the wild flock were killed on Campbell Island in the mid-1970s, a tiny group of 10 sheep was quietly picked out for a different fate. During the summer of 1975 to 1976, a science team penned the animals against a fence, chose 10 healthy ones, and loaded them onto a ship bound for New Zealand. The trip north was rough, with Southern Ocean swells, but those 10 sheep had already lived through years of gales, sleet, and thin feed. If any animals were going to handle the crossing, it was this group that had already shown it could survive without help. When the ship finally reached New Zealand, the sheep did not go straight to a hobby farm. They went into the care of government farm scientists. They spent time at places like Ruakura and Wata Wata Hill Country Research Station, both used by Ag Research for work on hill country flocks. To the people running those stations, these were not just oddball animals. They were a rare chance to see what a high-maintenance wool breed looked like after it had been forced to live as if it were wild for decades. Scientists wanted simple, practical answers. They weighed the sheep, clipped their wool, and watched how they bred over many years. Later studies compared Campbell Island sheep with other New Zealand feral flocks, like the Hokanui and Raglan sheep, and also with normal farm breeds, such as Saxon Merinos and Perrendales. The work showed a clear pattern. The feral sheep, including the Campbell animals, carried lighter fleeces than the big farm breeds, only around half as heavy as the wool grown by standard Merinos in the same country. In rough terms, a Campbell Island sheep might grow just over 3 pounds of wool in a year, whereas a fine wool Merino could grow more than 7 pounds. Those lighter fleeces were not a sign of weakness. In fact, the same studies found that Campbell Island sheep stayed in good body shape for many years. Their body weight rose to a peak in middle age and then slowly eased back, but they kept on breeding, raising lambs, and coping with the weather. When run in the same paddocks as domestic breeds for almost 3 decades, the feral groups held their own in basic health and lambing, even though nobody had ever tried to improve them for higher production. The wool itself was different in more subtle ways. When researchers looked closely at fibers under the microscope, they could see that Campbell Island sheep had a distinct style of crimp and curl in their fleece compared with other feral groups and with farm breeds. These details might sound small, but they matter when you are trying to understand how coats grow, shed, and protect the animal. The Campbell wool was not as heavy or greasy as fine merino fleeces and fit better with the easy care style many low-input farmers now want, where the sheep can shed part of its own coat and is less likely to run into problems from overgrown wool. For a while, this meant the Campbell Island sheep were mostly a research tool. They lived behind ordinary fences, under ordinary New Zealand skies, but their records fed into scientific papers about how feral flocks age, how wool growth changes over time, and how animals from long-closed populations compare with modern farm breeds. Once those core questions were answered, though, the flock risked sliding into the background. By around the early 2000s, the purebred Campbell group was no longer central to mainstream farm trials, and the number of animals was small. At that point, people who care about rare breeds stepped in. The descendants of those 10 rescued sheep were passed into the hands of the Rare Breeds Conservation Society of New Zealand, and then to a few private breeders. One of the most important of these is a Christchurch farmer named Daniel Wheeler. Wheeler became the main guardian of what was, by then, probably the rarest sheep breed on the planet. At most, he had a few dozen Campbell Island sheep, spread between his own property and nearby grazing land. Wheeler kept the flock small on purpose. A tiny breed like this can never be run in the thousands. There are too few animals to start with, and keeping them safe is already a struggle. Reports around 2017 say there were only about 30 to 35 Campbell Island sheep left in the world at that time, almost all of them in Wheeler's care. Each ewe mattered. Each lamb born was a small victory against the risk that the entire line could disappear with one disease outbreak, one fire, or one bad decision. That threat stopped being abstract in early September of 2017. Wheeler went to check on a group of his sheep at Sticks Mill Reserve on the edge of Christchurch. Instead of finding them grazing, he found a scene he later called gutting. 5 of his Campbell Island ewes had been killed and butchered. Their insides and unborn lambs were left in the grass, with only a knife case and piles of entrails to show what had happened. For any farmer, that sort of stock theft is a punch in the chest. For this flock, it was a disaster. Losing 5 ewes out of only about 35, especially when several were close to lambing, meant a large chunk of the remaining gene pool had been wiped out in one night. The police opened an investigation, but nothing came of it. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.